vehicle.
Okay.
Now!
Officer, I live here. This is my house. This is when
Keys on the dash. Step out.
I'm not a threat. Look at this. Federal judge, United States District Court.
Keep your hands where I can see them. Out of the car.
Yo, I'm recording this.
Doors coming open.
Officer, you are making a mistake.
Step out.
The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Ridgewood Heights, an exclusive suburb nestled in the rolling hills just north of Charlotte, North Carolina. It was the kind of neighborhood where American flags fluttered from wraparound porches, where children rode bicycles down tree-lined streets, and where the median home price hovered somewhere around $1.2 million. The residents here were doctors, corporate executives, successful entrepreneurs. And in one elegant colonial-style home at the end of Magnolia Court, a woman who had spent her entire career fighting for the principles that supposedly made this country great. What happened on this particular Wednesday afternoon in late September would eventually cost local taxpayers nearly $1 million. It would end careers, spark national outrage, and force an entire police department to confront uncomfortable truths about how it operated. But more than that, it would expose a bitter irony so profound that it almost defies belief, because the woman who would find herself in handcuffs in her own driveway that day had spent the past 15 years of her life presiding over civil rights cases from one of the highest benches in the American judicial system. Her name was Judge Veronica Harrison, and this is the story of how a routine trip home became one of the most expensive traffic stops in American history. Before we dive deeper into what unfolded on Magnolia Court that September afternoon, I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story. What you are about to hear goes far beyond a simple case of mistaken identity. It reveals something deeply troubling about the assumptions we make, the biases we carry, and the systems we have built. If stories like this matter to you, consider subscribing to this channel, because we believe that understanding these moments is the first step toward changing them. Veronica Harrison had risen before dawn that morning, as she did most weekdays, to prepare for what she knew would be a demanding day on the bench. At 54 years old, she had been serving as a federal district judge for nearly 12 years, appointed during the previous administration after a career that had taken her from a working-class neighborhood in Baltimore to the hallowed halls of Yale Law School and eventually to private practice at one of the most prestigious law firms on the East Coast. She had prosecuted white-collar criminals for the Department of Justice, argued cases before appellate courts across the country, and earned a reputation as one of the sharpest legal minds of her generation. But what made Judge Harrison particularly notable was her expertise in civil rights law. Throughout her career, she had been a fierce advocate for equal protection under the law, publishing articles in academic journals, speaking at conferences, and eventually handling some of the most complex discrimination cases to come through the federal court system. Her rulings were known for their precision, their careful attention to precedent, and their unflinching commitment to the principle that every person, regardless of their background, deserved to be treated with dignity and respect. The morning of September 22nd had been particularly intense. Judge Harrison had spent nearly 6 hours in her chambers poring over testimony and evidence in a lawsuit alleging systematic discrimination in hiring practices at a major regional employer. The case was complicated, involving statistical analyses, expert witnesses, and decades of personnel records. By the time she had finished reviewing the final briefs, her eyes were tired and her mind craved the comfort of home. She gathered her things shortly after 4 in the afternoon, exchanging brief pleasantries with her clerk and her administrative assistant before making her way to the parking garage beneath the federal courthouse. Her car, a sleek navy blue Lexus sedan that she had purchased just 5 months earlier, sat waiting in its reserved spot. She had treated herself to the luxury vehicle after years of driving sensible, practical cars, deciding that at this stage in her life, she had earned a small indulgence. The leather seats were comfortable, the sound system was excellent, and the smooth ride made her 40-minute commute to Ridgewood Heights something almost enjoyable. As she merged onto the highway heading north, Judge Harrison allowed her mind to wander through the events of the day. The civil rights case she had been reviewing struck close to her heart in ways that she rarely discussed publicly. She had grown up in a household where both parents worked multiple jobs to keep food on the table. Her father had been a maintenance worker at a downtown hotel, her mother a nurse's aide at a community hospital. Neither had attended college, but both had instilled in their daughter an unshakable belief in the power of education and the importance of standing up for what was right. There had been times in her career when Veronica Harrison had been underestimated. She remembered partners at her law firm who had assumed she was a secretary when she first arrived. She remembered defendants who had looked at her with barely concealed surprise when she took her seat on the bench. She remembered traffic stops in her younger years, the suspicious looks, the questions that went beyond routine. But she had always believed that by conducting herself with dignity and professionalism, by excelling at every task placed before her, she could rise above these moments and perhaps, in some small way, make them less likely to happen to others. The drive home was uneventful, the late afternoon traffic lighter than usual. She exited the highway at Ridgewood and wound her way through the familiar streets of her neighborhood. The leaves were just beginning to turn, hints of orange and gold appearing among the green. She passed the community park where she sometimes walked on weekend mornings, the small shopping plaza where she picked up groceries, the stone entrance markers that announced "Welcome to Ridgewood Heights," established 1987. Magnolia Court was a quiet cul-de-sac at the back of the development. Judge Harrison and her husband had purchased their home there nearly a decade ago, drawn by the privacy, the mature trees, and the sense of peaceful remove from the pressures of her demanding career. Her husband, a retired cardiologist, was currently visiting their daughter in Seattle, so the house would be empty when she arrived. She was looking forward to a quiet evening, perhaps a glass of wine on the back patio, while she watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and purple. She turned onto Magnolia Court at approximately 4:47 in the afternoon. Her house sat at the very end of the cul-de-sac, a graceful colonial with white columns and black shutters. The driveway curved gently past a row of ornamental cherry trees that her husband had planted the year after they moved in. Everything looked exactly as she had left it that morning. And then, in her rearview mirror, she noticed the police cruiser. It had appeared seemingly from nowhere, falling in behind her Lexus as she made the turn onto her street. She glanced at the mirror again, confirming what she had seen. The patrol car was unmarked, a dark gray sedan with subtle emergency lights mounted in the grille and on the dashboard. It maintained a consistent distance behind her, neither closing in nor falling back. Judge Harrison felt a small flutter of unease in her chest, the kind of instinctive alertness that comes from a lifetime of existing in spaces where your presence might be questioned. She pushed the feeling aside, reminding herself that there was no reason for concern. She had done nothing wrong. She was driving the speed limit on her own street, heading to her own home. She turned into her driveway and the patrol car followed, pulling in directly behind her and blocking her exit. For a moment, Judge Harrison simply sat in her car, processing what was happening. The engine of her Lexus hummed quietly. In her rearview mirror, she could see the officer still seated in his vehicle, speaking into his radio. The situation felt surreal, disconnected from any logical explanation. She was parked in her own driveway. Her house keys were in her purse. The afternoon sun was warm through the windshield. The officer emerged from his vehicle. He was a white man who appeared to be in his mid-30s, with a muscular build and a close-cropped haircut that suggested military background. His uniform was crisp, his equipment belt heavy with the tools of his profession. He approached her car with the practiced stride of someone who had conducted countless traffic stops, his right hand resting casually near his sidearm. Judge Harrison lowered her window. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, keeping her voice measured and calm. "Can I help you with something?" The officer positioned himself slightly behind her window, a tactical choice that allowed him to observe the interior of the vehicle while making it difficult for her to see his face directly. When he spoke, his tone was flat, carrying the kind of cool authority that suggests the speaker is not interested in explanations. "License and registration. Need to see them now." Judge Harrison felt the flutter in her chest intensify, but she maintained her composure. In her years on the bench, she had developed an ability to remain calm in tense situations, to observe and assess rather than react emotionally. This skill would prove essential in the minutes that followed. "Of course," she replied. "May I ask what this is regarding?" The officer did not answer her question. He simply repeated his demand, this time with an edge of impatience. "License, registration, now." Judge Harrison reached slowly and deliberately toward her purse, acutely aware that sudden movements in these situations could be misinterpreted with fatal consequences. She retrieved her wallet, extracted her driver's license, and then opened the glove compartment to remove the vehicle registration. She handed both documents through the window. The officer examined the license, then the registration. His brow furrowed slightly. He looked at the documents again, then at her, then back at the documents. "This your vehicle?" "Yes," Judge Harrison replied. "I have owned it for about 5 months." The officer made a sound that might have been skepticism or might have been simply acknowledgement. He walked back to his patrol car, taking her documents with him. Judge Harrison watched in her mirror as he sat in the driver's seat, presumably running her information through his computer system. "I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where you knew you had done nothing wrong, yet still felt a creeping sense of dread as authority figures scrutinized you? Have you ever had to carefully control your words, your movements, your facial expressions, because you understood that any perceived misstep could escalate a situation beyond your control? If this resonates with you, I would genuinely like to hear your story in the comments below, because what Judge Harrison was experiencing in those moments is something that millions of people understand all too well. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Judge Harrison remained in her car, acutely aware that getting out without being told to do so could be interpreted as aggressive or suspicious behavior. She thought about all the cases she had presided over, all the testimony she had heard about encounters just like this one. She thought about the statistics she knew by heart, the disparities in how traffic stops unfolded depending on who was behind the wheel. Finally, the officer returned to her window. "Ma'am, I need you to step out of the vehicle." Judge Harrison felt her heart rate increase, but her voice remained steady. "Officer, may I ask what is going on? I have provided you with my license and registration. This is my home. I live here." The officer's expression hardened. "I said step out of the vehicle. Now." For a federal judge accustomed to being the highest authority in any room she occupied, there was something profoundly disorienting about this moment. She had the legal knowledge to understand her rights perfectly. She knew that she could ask questions, that she could request to know the reason for the stop, that she had constitutional protections against unreasonable searches and seizures. But she also knew something else, something that transcended legal theory and entered the realm of survival. She knew that asserting those rights too forcefully could end very badly. Slowly, deliberately, Judge Harrison opened her car door and stepped out. The late afternoon sun was warm on her face, the air filled with the scent of cut grass and the distant sound of a lawnmower several houses away. It was an absurdly peaceful setting for what was becoming an increasingly tense confrontation. The officer directed her to move to the rear of the vehicle. She complied. He positioned himself several feet away, his stance wide, his hand once again near his weapon. "We received a report of a vehicle matching this description being involved in a theft," the officer said. "Navy blue Lexus. Same model, similar plate numbers." Judge Harrison absorbed this information, understanding now the ostensible reason for the stop. But the explanation raised immediate questions in her legally trained mind. Similar plate numbers was an extraordinarily vague standard. And what kind of theft would involve a luxury sedan driving calmly through a residential neighborhood at well below the speed limit? "Officer," she said carefully, "I can assure you that this vehicle has not been involved in any theft. I purchased it new from the dealership. I have the title documents inside my home, which is right there." She gestured toward the colonial house just 20 feet away. "I am more than happy to provide you with any additional documentation you might need." The officer's eyes narrowed. "You are saying this is your house?" "Yes. I have lived here for nearly 10 years. He looked at the house, then back at her. Something in his expression suggested doubt, though whether it was doubt about her statement or doubt about something else entirely was impossible to say. "Anybody inside who can verify that? My husband is out of town, but my neighbors can certainly confirm my identity. I can also show you identification with this address, utility bills, anything you might need." The officer seemed to consider this for a moment. Then he shook his head. "I need you to place your hands on the vehicle and remain still while I verify this information." Judge Harrison felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had handled hundreds of cases involving encounters between citizens and police. She knew that what was happening now had moved beyond the realm of a routine vehicle stop into something else entirely. But she also knew that her best chance of getting through this situation safely was to remain calm and compliant. She placed her hands on the trunk of her Lexus, The metal was warm from the afternoon sun. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. "Officer," she said, "I want to cooperate fully, but I want you to understand something. I am a federal judge. My name is Veronica Harrison. I sit on the district court bench downtown. If you contact your supervisor or check my credentials, this matter can be resolved very quickly." The officer let out a short, humorless laugh. "Sure you are." And with those 3 words, Judge Harrison understood that nothing she said was going to matter. The next several minutes unfolded with a kind of slow-motion inevitability that Judge Harrison would later describe as almost dreamlike. The officer called for backup, claiming he had a suspect who was being uncooperative and making unusual claims about her identity. Within minutes, a second patrol car arrived, this one marked with the full insignia of the Ridgewood Heights Police Department. The second officer, whose name was later identified as Deputy Kenneth Rawlings, approached the scene with his hand already on his weapon. He was younger than the first officer, perhaps late 20s, with a nervous energy that suggested either inexperience or anticipation. "What do we have here?" The first officer, whose name was Sergeant Michael Brennan, gestured toward Judge Harrison, who remained standing with her hands on her vehicle. "Pulled her over matching the description on that vehicle theft report from this afternoon. Claims she owns the car. Claims she lives here. Claims she is some kind of judge." Deputy Rawlings looked at the house, then at Judge Harrison, then at the Lexus. His hand remained near his weapon. "She got any proof?" "License and registration check out," Sergeant Brennan admitted. "But she could have gotten those anywhere. These car thieves are sophisticated, and something about this whole situation does not sit right with me." Judge Harrison listened to this exchange with growing disbelief. The officer had just acknowledged that her documentation was legitimate, yet he was still proceeding as though she were a criminal suspect. She thought about all the training materials she had reviewed in civil rights cases, all the testimony about how biases could shape perception, how stereotypes could override evidence. "Officer," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "please contact your precinct commander. My credentials can be verified in minutes. I'm asking you to make one phone call before this situation escalates further." Sergeant Brennan turned to face her, his expression hardening. "Ma'am, right now you are going to stop talking and keep your hands where I can see them. We will decide what calls get made and when. I know my rights. I am entitled to know why I am being detained. You are being detained because you are a suspect in a vehicle theft. And right now, your refusal to cooperate is making this a whole lot more complicated than it needs to be." Judge Harrison wanted to scream that she was not refusing to cooperate, that she had done nothing but cooperate, that she had stepped out of her vehicle, placed her hands where instructed, and offered to provide every possible form of verification. But she held her tongue, understanding that in this moment, her words carried no weight. She was not a federal judge on this driveway. She was just a black woman in an expensive car in an expensive neighborhood, and in the minds of these officers, that equation did not balance. What happened next would become the central focus of the investigation and the lawsuit that followed. Sergeant Brennan approached Judge Harrison and instructed her to turn around and place her hands behind her back. She complied, her movements slow and deliberate. She could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. The late afternoon sunlight seemed too bright, the colors of the world too vivid. The handcuffs were cold against her wrists. The sound they made as they clicked shut was a sound that Judge Harrison had heard thousands of times in her career. Defendants stood before her bench after that sound. Witnesses described that sound in testimony. It was the sound of freedom being curtailed, of liberty being constrained. She had never expected to experience it herself. Sergeant Brennan guided her toward his patrol car, his hand firm on her upper arm. Deputy Rawlings watched from several feet away, his thumbs hooked in his equipment belt. Neither officer had called for a supervisor. Neither had made any attempt to verify her identity beyond the initial license check. "You are making a serious mistake," Judge Harrison said, her voice finally cracking with emotion. "I have told you who I am. I have told you I can prove everything. Why will you not listen?" Sergeant Brennan opened the rear door of his cruiser. "Ma'am, you can tell all of this to the detectives at the station." And that was when the first neighbor appeared. Her name was Dorothy Chen, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the house directly adjacent to Judge Harrison's property for the past 7 years. She had been tending to her garden when she noticed the commotion in her neighbor's driveway, At first, she had assumed it was some sort of routine matter, but when she saw Judge Harrison being placed in handcuffs, she had hurried across her lawn with an urgency that belied her 73 years. "Excuse me, what is going on here? That is Veronica Harrison. She is a federal judge." Sergeant Brennan turned to face the new arrival, his expression irritated at the interruption. "Ma'am, I need you to step back. This is police business." Dorothy Chen did not step back. She moved closer, her face flushed with indignation. "I have known Veronica for years. We have dinner together. We attend the same church. She is one of the most respected people in this community. Whatever you think she has done, you are wrong." Deputy Rawlings moved to intercept the elderly woman, positioning himself between her and the scene. "Ma'am, you need to return to your property immediately. This does not concern you." "It most certainly does concern me. You are arresting my neighbor in her own driveway." The commotion had attracted additional attention. Across the street, a man named Robert Tillman had emerged from his garage where he had been working on a woodworking project. He stood at the edge of his property, watching the scene with growing alarm. Further down the cul-de-sac, a young mother named Jessica Moore had paused her evening walk, her infant daughter in a stroller beside her. "What is happening?" Robert Tillman called out. "Is everything okay?" "I need everyone to remain calm and stay back," Sergeant Brennan announced, his voice carrying the tone of someone losing control of a situation. "We are conducting an investigation." Dorothy Chen had not stopped her advance. She reached into the pocket of her gardening apron and produced her cell phone. "I am recording this," she announced. "I want everyone to see what is happening here." The introduction of a camera changed the dynamic immediately. Deputy Rawlings moved toward Dorothy Chen with clear agitation. "Ma'am, put that phone away." "You do not have the right to record this." "Actually," Dorothy Chen replied, "I most certainly do. We are in a public space, and I have every right to document what I am witnessing." Judge Harrison, standing at the open door of the patrol car, with her hands cuffed behind her back, felt a small surge of hope at her neighbor's intervention. She also felt a deep well of gratitude for Dorothy Chen's courage. Not everyone would be willing to confront armed police officers on behalf of a neighbor, regardless of the circumstances. "Please," Judge Harrison said, her voice carrying across the driveway, "just call the federal courthouse. Ask for Judge Veronica Harrison's chambers. They will confirm everything." For a long moment, no one moved. The scene seemed frozen, a tableau of conflict and confusion playing out in the golden light of a September afternoon. Sergeant Brennan stood near his vehicle, one hand still on Judge Harrison's arm. Deputy Rawlings faced Dorothy Chen and her recording phone. The other neighbors watched from their respective positions, witnesses to something they could not quite believe. And then another police vehicle arrived. This time, it was a marked supervisor's car, driven by Lieutenant Angela Martinez, a 20-year veteran of the Ridgewood Heights Police Department. She had been monitoring the radio traffic and had grown concerned by what she was hearing. A vehicle theft suspect who claimed to be a federal judge, detained in her own driveway, with civilian witnesses on scene. The situation had all the hallmarks of something that could go very wrong very quickly. Lieutenant Martinez exited her vehicle and took in the scene with practiced assessment. Judge Harrison in handcuffs, two officers looking defensive, an elderly civilian with a camera phone, multiple witnesses on surrounding properties. Her law enforcement instincts told her that something had gone sideways here. "Talk to me," she said to Sergeant Brennan. "What is the situation?" Sergeant Brennan began to explain, his words coming quickly and with a defensive edge. The vehicle theft report, the matching description, the suspect's claims about being a judge. Lieutenant Martinez listened, then turned to look at the handcuffed woman standing beside the patrol car. "Ma'am, I am Lieutenant Angela Martinez. Can you tell me your full name and occupation?" "My name is Veronica Louise Harrison. I am a federal district judge for the Western District of North Carolina. My chambers are located in the federal courthouse downtown. My clerk's name is Jonathan Reeves. My administrative assistant is Sandra Mitchell. You can reach them at the main courthouse number, which is 704-555-0100. Lieutenant Martinez studied the woman before her. There was something in her bearing, in the precise way she articulated information that suggested credibility. She had seen thousands of suspects over her career, and this woman did not present like someone who had stolen a car. She turned back to Sergeant Brennan. "Did you run her credentials through any database beyond DMV?" "Well, no, but the vehicle matched the description and—" "Did you contact the federal courthouse to verify her claims?" She just made those claims. I was not going to fall for some elaborate story. Did you speak to any of these neighbors who apparently know this woman? Lieutenant Martinez. I was following protocol for a vehicle theft stop. Lieutenant Martinez held up her hand, silencing him. She pulled out her own cell phone and dialed a number from memory. It was the main line for the federal courthouse, a number she knew because she had testified in federal cases on several occasions. The call took less than 3 minutes. When Lieutenant Martinez ended the call, her expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something closer to controlled anger. She walked over to Judge Harrison, her movements deliberate and respectful. Judge Harrison, I'm going to remove these handcuffs now. I apologize for this situation. Your identity has been verified. The relief that washed over Judge Harrison was physical, a release of tension that she had not realized she was holding. As the handcuffs came off, she rubbed her wrists, feeling the indentations where the metal had pressed into her skin. She had been restrained for nearly 40 minutes, but the ordeal was not quite over. Lieutenant Martinez turned to face her subordinates, and the conversation that followed would prove crucial to the investigation. Sergeant Brennan, Deputy Rawlings, I want you both back at the precinct immediately. I will be writing a detailed report on this incident, and there will be a full internal affairs review. Sergeant Brennan's face flushed with anger. I was following procedure. Vehicle matched the description. How was I supposed to know she was actually some kind of judge? Because she told you, Lieutenant Martinez replied. Because her neighbors told you. Because every piece of documentation checked out. And because your job is to investigate and verify, not to assume guilt and proceed accordingly. The two officers departed, their patrol cars pulling away from Magnolia Court with a heaviness that suggested they understood the severity of what had happened. Lieutenant Martinez remained with Judge Harrison for another 20 minutes, taking her statement, ensuring she had information about how to file a formal complaint, and apologizing repeatedly for her department's conduct. When everyone had finally left, and the quiet of the cul-de-sac had returned, Judge Harrison stood alone in her driveway, looking at the house she had called home for nearly a decade. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in the colors she had imagined enjoying from her back patio. But the evening ahead would not be peaceful. Her mind was already racing through the implications of what had just occurred. Dorothy Chen approached from her property, concern evident in her eyes. Veronica, are you all right? Should I call someone? Judge Harrison turned to face her neighbor, the woman who had rushed to her defense without hesitation. Thank you, Dorothy. What you did today, that took real courage. Dorothy Chen shook her head. What I did was basic human decency. What those officers did was unconscionable. They stood together for a moment in the fading light, two neighbors processing an event that had shaken their understanding of the community they lived in. I have spent my entire career working within the legal system, Judge Harrison said quietly. I have believed that the system, despite its flaws, fundamentally works. Today, that belief was challenged. She paused, her gaze turning inward. But I also know that I have resources and credibility that many people in my position do not have. If this can happen to me, a federal judge, in my own driveway, with neighbors willing to vouch for me. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. The implications hung in the evening air, heavy and unavoidable. What happened in the days following the incident on Magnolia Court would reveal a pattern of conduct that went far beyond a single traffic stop. It would expose systemic failures, institutional blindness, and a culture that had been allowed to fester unchecked for years. Judge Harrison contacted an attorney the following morning. His name was Marcus Webb, a civil rights lawyer with a reputation for taking on cases involving police misconduct. When she walked into his office and explained what had happened, his initial reaction was disbelief, not because he doubted her account, but because the facts were so extreme. You're telling me that a federal judge was handcuffed in her own driveway after providing documentation that checked out while neighbors confirmed her identity and the officers still proceeded with an arrest. That is exactly what I am telling you. Marcus Webb leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from disbelief to determination. Judge Harrison, I have handled a lot of cases in my career, but I have never seen facts quite like these. If what you are describing is accurate, and if there is documentation to support it, this could be one of the most significant civil rights cases in this state's recent history. The documentation was substantial. Dorothy Chen had recorded nearly 15 minutes of video on her cell phone, capturing the moment Judge Harrison was placed in handcuffs, the confrontation with the officers, and the intervention of Lieutenant Martinez. Additionally, Sergeant Brennan's patrol car was equipped with a dashboard camera that had recorded the entire encounter from a different angle. When Marcus Webb obtained both videos through the discovery process, what they revealed was damning. The dashboard camera showed Sergeant Brennan approaching Judge Harrison's vehicle with his hand already on his weapon, a tactical choice typically reserved for high-risk stops. It showed him ignoring her repeated attempts to explain her identity. It showed him making the decision to handcuff her even after her documentation had been verified. And perhaps most significantly, it captured audio of a radio conversation between Brennan and another officer at the station. Got a black female in Ridgewood Heights claiming she lives there, driving a new Lexus. You believe that? Something is definitely not right here. That recording would prove crucial in establishing that racial bias had influenced Sergeant Brennan's decisions throughout the encounter. The internal affairs investigation that followed uncovered a troubling history. Sergeant Michael Brennan had been with the Ridgewood Heights Police Department for 9 years. During that time, he had accumulated 16 formal complaints from citizens, 13 of which involved allegations of racial profiling or bias. In multiple instances, Black and Hispanic drivers had reported being stopped by Brennan for vague reasons, held for extended periods, and treated with suspicion that was not supported by the facts of the encounter. None of these complaints had resulted in serious disciplinary action. The investigation also revealed statistical patterns that were difficult to explain through race-neutral factors. Sergeant Brennan's traffic stop data showed that he pulled over Black drivers at nearly 5 times the rate that would be expected based on the demographics of the areas where he patrolled. Hispanic drivers were stopped at roughly 3 times the expected rate. In contrast, his stop rate for white drivers was actually lower than departmental averages. When investigators interviewed other officers about Brennan's conduct, a picture emerged of someone who had been a problem for years but had been protected by a culture of silence and institutional inertia. Several officers, speaking anonymously, described incidents where Brennan had made derogatory comments about minority residents, had advocated for aggressive policing in what he called certain neighborhoods, and had been openly dismissive of complaints filed against him. One officer, who later agreed to testify, recalled a specific conversation in the precinct break room. Brennan said something like, "These people from the city think they can move out here and fit in, but they do not belong here, and we need to let them know that." I remember thinking it was wrong, but I did not say anything. That is on me. The lawsuit filed by Marcus Webb on behalf of Judge Harrison named Sergeant Michael Brennan, Deputy Kenneth Rawlings, and the Ridgewood Heights Police Department as defendants. It alleged violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments, racial discrimination, false arrest, and failure to supervise and discipline. The case attracted immediate national attention. A Black federal judge handcuffed in her own driveway was a story that captured the public imagination because it illustrated how even the most accomplished, credentialed individuals were not immune to the kind of treatment that civil rights advocates had been documenting for decades. News networks ran segments featuring the dashboard camera footage and Dorothy Chen's cell phone video. Legal analysts debated the merits of the case. Social media exploded with commentary, both supportive and critical. Some argued that Judge Harrison's experience was an isolated incident, a case of one bad apple making poor decisions. Others pointed to the broader patterns revealed by the investigation as evidence of systemic problems. Judge Harrison herself gave several interviews in the weeks following the incident, speaking carefully and thoughtfully about what she had experienced. "I've spent my career adjudicating cases involving allegations of discrimination and civil rights violations," she told one reporter. "I have always believed that the legal system provides meaningful recourse for people who have been wronged. What happened to me has not changed that fundamental belief, but it has given me a visceral understanding of what it feels like to be judged not by your conduct or your character, but by assumptions that are made the moment someone looks at you." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I was fortunate that day. I had neighbors who knew me and were willing to speak up. I had the knowledge and resources to understand my rights and to seek accountability. Many people who experience what I experienced do not have those advantages, And that is why this case matters beyond my personal situation. It is about asking whether we are truly committed to the principle that all people are equal under the law. If you have been following this story, I want to ask you something directly. What would you have done in Judge Harrison's position? Would you have been able to maintain the same calm, the same composure, while being treated as a criminal in your own driveway? And perhaps more importantly, what responsibility do we all have when we witness injustice happening to someone else? Leave your thoughts in the comments. These conversations matter because they are how we start to change things. The legal proceedings moved forward over the following months. Sergeant Michael Brennan was terminated from the Ridgewood Heights Police Department 4 weeks after the incident. His firing came after a departmental review found that he had violated multiple policies during the encounter with Judge Harrison, including failure to properly investigate, failure to de-escalate, and conduct unbecoming an officer. The 16 prior complaints in his file were cited as evidence of a pattern of behavior that the department had failed to address. Deputy Kenneth Rawlings received a formal reprimand and was required to undergo additional training, though he retained his position. The lawsuit itself was eventually settled on the eve of trial after nearly 20 months of litigation. The settlement amount was $875,000 paid by the city's insurance carrier. But perhaps more significantly, the settlement included a commitment to comprehensive reforms within the Ridgewood Heights Police Department. These reforms included mandatory bias training for all officers, new protocols for vehicle stops that emphasize de-escalation and verification, enhanced civilian oversight of the complaint process, and regular auditing of traffic stop data to identify potential patterns of discrimination. The department was also required to implement an early warning system that would flag officers who accumulated multiple complaints, ensuring that patterns like Sergeant Brennan's would be identified and addressed before they resulted in serious incidents. Judge Harrison donated a portion of her settlement to organizations working on police reform and civil rights advocacy. She also established a scholarship fund for students from underrepresented backgrounds pursuing careers in law. In a statement released after the settlement was announced, she reflected on the significance of the outcome. No amount of money can undo what happened that afternoon in my driveway. The humiliation, the fear, the profound sense of being reduced to a stereotype despite everything I have accomplished in my life. Those memories will stay with me forever. But this settlement and the reforms that accompany it represent a recognition that what happened to me should not happen to anyone. They represent a commitment, however imperfect, to doing better. And they represent a measure of accountability in a system that too often protects those who abuse their power. She continued, "I became a judge because I believe in the law. I believe in its power to protect the vulnerable, to hold the powerful accountable, and to provide a framework for resolving disputes peacefully and fairly. What I experienced on September 22nd tested that belief in ways I never anticipated, but ultimately it also reinforced it because the legal system did provide recourse. The facts did come to light. The officer who violated my rights did face consequences. And perhaps most importantly, the community heard this story and said no more. The case of Judge Veronica Harrison became a touchstone in discussions about racial profiling and police accountability. It was cited in academic articles, referenced in legislative debates, and discussed in police training programs across the country. The dashboard camera footage was used in documentaries examining the persistence of bias in American law enforcement. For the residents of Ridgewood Heights, the incident prompted a period of uncomfortable reflection. The neighborhood had prided itself on being welcoming and diverse, yet a federal judge had been treated like a criminal in her own driveway while claiming to belong there. Some residents organized community forums to discuss policing and race. Others pushed back, arguing that the incident had been overblown and that the officer had simply been doing his job. Dorothy Chen, the neighbor whose intervention had been crucial to the eventual outcome, became something of a local hero. She was invited to speak at community events about the importance of being a witness and the responsibility that comes with seeing something wrong. "I did not do anything extraordinary," she said at one such event. "I saw my neighbor being treated unjustly, and I spoke up. That should be ordinary. That should be what all of us do." Judge Harrison returned to the bench after a brief leave of absence. Her docket continued to include civil rights cases, and her rulings continued to reflect her commitment to equal treatment under the law. Colleagues described her as unchanged in her fundamental approach, but deepened in her understanding. There is a difference, she told a gathering of law students several months after the settlement, between understanding something intellectually and experiencing it personally. I had adjudicated cases involving people who claimed they were profiled, who claimed they were judged based on how they looked rather than what they had done. I believed those claims when the evidence supported them, but I did not fully understand what it felt like to be in that position until I experienced it myself. She looked out at the assembled students, many of whom were aspiring lawyers and judges themselves. When you go out into the world and pursue your careers, remember that the people who come before you seeking justice are not abstractions. They are human beings whose experiences are as real and as valid as your own. Never forget that, and never stop asking yourself whether the systems you are part of are truly serving everyone equally. The story of Judge Veronica Harrison and the traffic stop on Magnolia Court does not have a neat ending. The reforms implemented in Ridgewood Heights have shown promise, but challenges remain. Other communities continue to grapple with similar issues. The broader questions about policing, race, and justice in America remain unresolved, but what happened that September afternoon matters because it forced a reckoning. It made visible what is often invisible. It reminded us that credentials and accomplishments do not insulate anyone from discrimination, and that the responsibility for creating a more just society belongs to all of us. Judge Harrison continues her work on the bench, applying the law with the same precision and commitment that defined her career before the incident. But she carries with her the memory of standing in her own driveway with her hands cuffed behind her back, the memory of being told that her identity documents and her neighbor's testimony and her position as a federal judge were all insufficient to override the assumptions being made about her. That memory informs every ruling she makes, and it serves as a reminder that the pursuit of equal justice under law is not a destination but a journey, one that requires vigilance, courage, and an unwavering commitment to seeing every person as fully human and fully deserving of dignity. As we bring this story to a close, I want to leave you with a question that has stayed with me throughout the research and writing of this account. We talk often about justice, about accountability, about reform, but what does it actually take to change a system that has failed so many people for so long? Is it lawsuits and settlements and policy reforms? Is it training in oversight and data analysis? Or is it something more fundamental, a shift in how we see each other and treat each other in our daily lives? Judge Veronica Harrison believes it requires all of these things and more. She believes that progress is possible, even when it is painfully slow. And she believes that every person who chooses to speak up, to bear witness, to demand better, brings us one step closer to the ideals we claim to hold. If this story has made you think, if it has made you question, if it has made you resolve to pay closer attention to the world around you, then it has served its purpose. Consider subscribing to this channel if you want to hear more stories like this one, stories that illuminate the challenges we face and the possibilities for change. And the next time you encounter someone being treated unjustly, remember Dorothy Chen walking across her lawn with a cell phone in her hand. Remember that ordinary courage can make an extraordinary difference. Remember that the choice to bear witness is one that all of us can make. Thank you for staying with me through this story. Your engagement and your thoughtfulness are what make these conversations possible. Until next time, take care of yourselves and each other.